The mist lay low over the fields of southern England, pale as breath upon glass, blurring hedgerows and softening the sharp lines of a country that had grown tired of its own grandeur. It was the spring of 1814, though the land bore little sign of renewal. War had stretched its long shadow even here, far from cannon fire and blooded soil, and peace, whispered now in Parliament and taverns alike, had not yet found its way into the hearts of men or the ledgers of families whose fortunes had quietly bled away. At the edge of this quiet, wavering world stood an estate that once commanded respect and now merely asked for remembrance. The house was old, not yet ruined, but leaning toward it with a weary dignity. Ivy clung to its stone walls as though attempting to hold the structure together by sheer devotion. Windows that once blazed with candlelight now reflected only the dull gray of the morning sky. This was the ancestral home of a baronetcy that had survived centuries on little more than pride and careful marriages, and it was here that the baronet's daughter moved silently through familiar corridors, each step measured, each breath restrained, as though the walls themselves might overhear her resolve and crumble in protest. She had risen before dawn, long before the servants stirred, long before duty could awaken and claim her again. The gown she wore was simple, chosen not for beauty but for movement. Her dark hair was bound plainly at her nape, stripped of the ornaments expected of her station. There was no mirror consulted, no lingering farewell paid to the room in which she had grown from girlhood into a woman painfully aware of her own limitations. Nostalgia, she knew, was a luxury she could not afford this morning. In the small traveling bag at her side lay the sum of her immediate future, a modest allowance taken without permission, a change of clothes, a folded letter addressed to her father, written with care and restraint. She had not accused him nor begged forgiveness. She had written instead of gratitude, of duty fulfilled as far as she was able, and of a hope, quietly phrased, that he might one day understand why she could not remain. The ink had dried without blot or tremor, though her hand had ached long after. The betrothal she fled had been decided with equal neatness. The Earl was a man of considerable wealth and advancing years, his estates flourishing, his title secure. He had been courteous, even kind, and entirely uninterested in the inner life of the young woman he intended to make his wife. To her father, the match represented salvation. Debts settled, appearances preserved, a lineage spared humiliation. To her, it was a slow erasure, a future measured not in joy or choice, but in obligation endured with polite endurance. She told herself she fled for freedom, and perhaps that was true. Yet freedom alone would not have driven her from the only home she had known into the uncertain mercy of the world. Beneath her resolve lay something more fragile and more dangerous, the refusal to let her heart be bartered after it had already been broken. That fracture had occurred a year earlier, though she rarely permitted herself to trace it so clearly. Memory had a way of loosening one's grip on the present, and she needed her courage intact. Still, as she stepped out into the cold morning air and drew her cloak close, the past stirred, unwelcome yet insistent, like a wound that had never quite sealed. The path from the house to the front gates was familiar, worn smooth by decades of carriage wheels and generations of arrival and departure. She had walked it countless times in daylight, under the watchful eyes of society, her pace dictated by decorum. Now she walked it alone, the gravel whispering beneath her boots, the mist damp against her lashes. Each step carried her further from certainty and closer to whatever fate awaited beyond the iron bars ahead. The gate stood open, as it always did during the day, a gesture of welcome that had long since lost its meaning. Beyond it stretched the road, pale and empty, leading toward a future she had not yet named. Her heart beat faster as she approached, not from fear of discovery, there was no one to stop her now, but from the weight of finality. Once she crossed that threshold, there would be no graceful return, no explanation that could restore her place as it had been. She slowed, then stopped altogether. The sound reached her first, the soft, unmistakable rhythm of hooves upon damp earth. It was measured, controlled, too deliberate to belong to a passing traveler. Her breath caught, and for a moment she told herself it was coincidence, that the world did not arrange itself around her private decisions. Yet instinct, sharpened by a year of quiet endurance, urged her to turn. He waited just beyond the gate, his horse standing calm beneath him, dark against the pale morning. The Duke of Harlan sat straight-backed in the saddle, gloved hands resting loosely upon the reins, his posture betraying neither haste nor surprise. He was dressed plainly for a man of his rank, his coat well cut but unadorned, his presence commanding without ostentation. The mist curled around him as though reluctant to release its hold, lending him an air at once solid and unreal. For a suspended moment, neither of them spoke. She had imagined this meeting in other forms, in other places, never here, never now. A year had passed since she last saw him, and yet the sight of him struck her with the force of something immediate and unresolved. He looked older, not merely by time but by experience, his face leaner, the familiar restraint in his expression edged now with something harder, something earned. His eyes, when they met hers, held no easy warmth, but neither did they avert themselves. He dismounted with controlled grace, boots touching the ground as though he had rehearsed the motion. When he removed his hat, it was done out of habit rather than ceremony, and the gesture revealed a faint scar near his temple, pale against weathered skin. War had marked him, she realized, just as silence had marked her. "I had hoped," he said at last, his voice low and steady, "that I might find you before you were gone." The words settled between them, heavy with implication. He knew then. Of her intent, of her desperation, of the choice she stood poised to make. How he had come by that knowledge she did not ask. There were too many other questions pressing for acknowledgement, and none of them felt safe. "You have found me," she replied, equally controlled, though her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her bag. Whether that alters anything remains to be seen. A flicker passed across his expression, gone almost before it could be named. Regret, perhaps, or recognition. He studied her as though committing her to memory, taking in the simplicity of her dress, the determination in her stance. There was no censure in his gaze, only an awareness that something irrevocable stood poised between them. The world beyond the gate remained still, the road empty, the mist unbroken. Behind her, the house loomed in quiet expectation, unaware that it was about to lose her. Between past and future, duty and desire, silence and truth, they stood facing one another, the weight of a year pressing into the fragile present. She took a step forward, not toward him, but toward the open road. He did not move to stop her. Instead, he spoke her name, softly, once, and in that single utterance lay everything he had not said before, and everything she feared she might still hear. The morning held its breath. A year earlier, before silence hardened into something like fate, the Duke of Harlan had been a man defined by absence rather than action. Even then he was known throughout the counties not for extravagance or charm, but for restraint so complete it bordered on severity. His title was old, his estates intact, his manners faultless. Yet society regarded him with a cautious respect, as though aware that beneath the polished surface lay depths best left undisturbed. He had been raised to believe that duty was not merely a principle, but a shelter against chaos, and he wore it as others wore armor. When first he came to the baronet's estate, it was not with intention. He had been invited as part of a small, carefully assembled gathering meant to reassure creditors and impress potential allies. The house, already slipping from its former glory, had seemed to him a place caught between memory and necessity. He had arrived late in the afternoon, the light low and forgiving, expecting nothing more than an evening of measured conversation and polite endurance. Instead, he had encountered her. She had been standing near one of the tall windows in the drawing room, the fading sun catching in her hair, lending it a quiet brilliance. She was not dressed to command attention, yet attention bent toward her all the same, as though drawn by a gravity she neither sought nor acknowledged. When she turned at the sound of his name being announced, her expression held curiosity rather than calculation, and something in that unguarded response unsettled him at once. Their first exchange had been unremarkable in content and unforgettable in effect. They spoke of weather, of the slow return of officers from the continent, of books recently read and those half forgotten. Yet beneath the surface of every sentence lay an awareness neither dared articulate. She listened as though she expected to be understood, and he answered as though he were discovering the possibility of speaking freely for the first time in years. In the days that followed, their acquaintance deepened without ceremony. They walked the grounds in the late afternoons, always accompanied, always careful. Conversation unfolded in measured layers, revealing intellect, humor, and a shared unease with the rigid expectations that framed their lives. He found himself anticipating her presence with a quiet intensity that surprised him. She, in turn, learned to recognize the subtle shifts in his tone that signaled amusement, concern, or restraint stretched thin. It was restraint that defined them. In another age, another world, affection might have declared itself plainly. Here, it hid in pauses and glances, in the careful distance maintained between their hands as they walked. Society watched them with interest but little suspicion. The match, had it been proposed, would have been considered acceptable. Yet neither spoke of it, as though naming the possibility would shatter the fragile balance they had achieved. Then the summons came. War, which had lingered at the edges of their conversations like a distant storm, moved suddenly into the center of his life. Orders arrived without sentiment, and duty answered without hesitation. He was to return to the continent, to join a campaign whose outcome remained uncertain. The night before his departure, he stood with her beneath the same window where they had first spoken, the room empty, the house quiet. What passed between them then was not a declaration, but something perilously close. He spoke of obligation, of honor, of the necessity of return. She listened without protest, her composure intact, though her eyes betrayed a fear she did not name. He wanted desperately to promise her something more than his return, but the words lodged behind years of discipline. To bind her to uncertainty, to risk her future on his survival, felt to him like a betrayal disguised as romance. So he left without confession, believing silence the kinder choice. The months that followed were marked by distance and distortion. Letters were written and never sent. News arrived sporadically, filtered through rumor and official notice. She learned of battles won and lost, of casualties unnamed, of officers praised for valor. Each report sharpened her anxiety, though pride forbade her from seeking reassurance beyond what propriety allowed. At home, circumstances tightened. Her father's patience frayed, his concern edging toward desperation. The Earl's interest solidified into expectation. She resisted quietly at first, offering delays, appealing to sentiment. Yet time, relentless and unsympathetic, eroded her arguments. Without word from the Duke, without even the courtesy of explanation, she found herself forced to reinterpret their past as she could. Silence, after all, carried meaning. When the Duke returned, it was not with triumph but with exhaustion. The war had marked him in ways he could not easily articulate. He had seen men younger than himself broken by ambition, by fear, by the weight of decisions made too quickly. Survival had stripped him of illusion, leaving behind a clarity that was both gift and burden. He came home resolved to restore order to his life, to act with the decisiveness he had once lacked. It was then he learned of her impending betrothal. The knowledge struck him with unexpected force. He had told himself that distance protected her, that absence preserved her freedom. Instead, it had delivered her into a future chosen by others. Guilt, sharp and unyielding, displaced every careful justification he had constructed. Yet even then he hesitated. To intervene now would be to disrupt not only her prospects but her reputation. To remain silent would be to accept the consequences of his restraint. He chose disastrously to wait. When at last he sought her out, the meeting was brief and painfully formal. She received him with courtesy unmarred by warmth, her demeanor a mirror of the distance he had imposed. He spoke of his return, of his hopes for peace. She answered with measured politeness, never once granting him the intimacy of reproach. The absence of accusation wounded him more deeply than anger might have. He left that meeting convinced he had lost the right to speak further. In the weeks that followed, regret settled into him like a second skin. He learned, too late, that honor unaccompanied by courage was merely another form of cowardice. When word reached him that she intended to leave before the betrothal could be finalized, urgency replaced hesitation. He acted at once, riding through the night, driven by the knowledge that some moments, once past, could never be reclaimed. Now, as the memory of that year pressed against the present, he stood before her at the gate, aware that explanation might not suffice and apology might not be enough. The past lay between them, unalterable, yet the future hovered uncertainly ahead. Whether she would grant him the chance to bridge that distance remained unanswered, and the road before them stretched on, indifferent to the weight of their choice. The road beyond the gate waited in pale silence, its surface damp with dew, its direction offering neither promise nor warning. She stood with one foot poised forward, the other anchored by habit, aware that the smallest movement would commit her irrevocably. The Duke remained still, allowing the space between them to hold its charge, as though he understood that any attempt to close it prematurely would only harden her resolve. The air smelled of wet earth and distant blossoms, a fragile sweetness that belied the gravity of the moment. "You need not stop," he said quietly, though the words carried an unmistakable plea. "I will not presume to command you." She turned to face him fully then, her expression composed yet taut, like a carefully tuned string. "And yet you have come," she replied. "You have followed me here, knowing what it costs a woman to be seen hesitating at such a moment." He inclined his head, accepting the truth of the rebuke without defense. "I have come because a year ago I mistook silence for honor," he said. "And because I have learned that absence is not restraint but abandonment." The confession was simple, stripped of ornament, and it struck her more deeply for its lack of drama. She had imagined apologies that begged, explanations that excused. Instead, he offered acknowledgment, bare and unshielded. It unsettled her, threatening the careful equilibrium she had constructed from disappointment and resolve. "You left," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor that stirred beneath. "You returned and spoke as though nothing had passed, as though my life had waited in stasis for your convenience. What am I to make of this sudden urgency?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Make of it what you will," he answered. "I deserve no generosity of interpretation. But understand this, when I left I believed I was sparing you uncertainty. When I returned I believed I had forfeited the right to disturb your future." Both beliefs were born of fear. The word lingered between them, stark and unadorned. Fear was not a quality often ascribed to men like him, nor to the world that had shaped him. To hear it spoken so plainly altered something fundamental in the balance of their exchange. She drew a slow breath. "And what of my fear?" she asked. "What of the months spent wondering whether I had imagined your regard, whether I had mistaken courtesy for affection? Do you imagine silence protects the one left behind?" "No," he said at once. "I imagine it wounds more deeply than truth ever could." The admission loosened something within her, though it did not yet free her. She stepped closer to the gate, resting her hand against the cold iron. Behind her lay obligation, respectability, a life secured at the cost of self-erasure. Before her stood uncertainty embodied, a man offering no guarantees beyond honesty hard-won. "You offer me no assurances," she said. "No promise of ease or approval." "I offer you none," he agreed. "I have learned how easily promises are broken by circumstance. What I offer is choice, freely given, and a willingness to stand beside you whatever that choice may be." The road remained empty but time pressed forward all the same. Somewhere behind them the household would soon awaken. The world would resume its careful arrangements, indifferent to private reckonings. She was keenly aware that delay itself was a decision, one that could not be sustained indefinitely. She studied him as she had not allowed herself to do before, taking in the signs of endurance etched into his features, the quiet resolve that had survived disillusionment. This was not the man she had known a year ago, nor was she the woman who had waited in silence. Whatever lay between them now was forged from loss as much as longing. "If I remain," she said slowly, "it will not be as I was. I cannot return to expectation or patience. I will not accept a place shaped solely by duty." "Nor should you," he replied. "I would not ask it. And if I leave," she continued, "it will not be in ignorance. I will go knowing what I relinquish and knowing that I was seen." His expression softened, though his posture remained composed. "Then whatever path you choose," he said, "it will be your own." The simplicity of the truth steadied her. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the muted sounds of the morning, the distant call of a bird, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a rising breeze. When she opened them again, her gaze was clear. She lifted her bag and set it down beside the gate, not as a declaration but as a pause. His attention followed the movement, though he made no attempt to interpret it aloud. Respect, she realized, was not measured by restraint alone, but by the willingness to endure uncertainty without seizing control. "I cannot decide my entire future in this moment," she said. "But I can decide this morning." He waited. "I will not go forward as planned," she continued. "Nor will I return as though nothing has changed. If there is to be anything between us, it must be spoken, not assumed, and it must withstand the scrutiny of the world we inhabit." A faint smile touched his mouth, restrained yet unmistakably genuine. "Then allow me to begin," he said. "Not with persuasion but with truth." She inclined her head, granting permission without surrender. The mist began to lift, thinning as the sun rose higher, revealing the road in clearer lines. The house behind them remained, silent witness to a turning it could not prevent. Between the solidity of the past and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, they stood, no longer bound by silence alone. He extended his hand not as an invitation but as an offering. She looked at it for a long moment, aware that whether she took it now or later mattered less than the fact that it was offered openly at last. The morning advanced around them, and though nothing was yet resolved, the stillness that followed carried the quiet promise of movement, of lives no longer held in suspension.